everybody. How's it going? Welcome to Gorgeous Wildlife. I see a few of you joining us now. Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. We're just getting things set up here. Thank you for joining us. Looks like we got about 120 of you. I'll give you just another minute to get settled in. Again, hi everyone. I'm going to take another minute to give folks still joining us a little bit more time to get settled. If you're new to Zoom webinar, I wanted to run through a few things to quickly familiarize you. You'll notice your microphone is muted. That's why we can't hear you talk, and that is because with so many of us here together, it's best to give everyone the best chance to hear clearly without each other's background noise. Throughout this webinar, there are two ways to interact with all of us: through the Q&A box or the chat box, which is at the bottom of your computer screen in that black toolbar. If you can't see that black toolbar, go ahead and give your mouse a little shake and it should come up. With hundreds of you on this webinar right now, we've decided to, it's best to hold questions until the end of the webinar to ensure we have enough time to get through everything. After Joe's presentation, we'll go straight into Q&A for about 10 to 15 minutes. If you have a question for Francis or Joe or anything related to the presentation, please type your question into the Q&A box in that black toolbar at the bottom of your computer screen. If you have a question for me about Zoom or about Friends, maybe you're interested in becoming a member, please type your question into the chat box. If you accidentally leave a question for Joe or Francis in the chat box, please know it will be missed, or it may be missed because we are watching the Q&A for Joe's and Francis's questions. To go through a few more things, if you would like to view the presenter fully on your screen, go ahead and click that speaker view box. It's at the right-hand top of your screen. This enables whoever is speaking to be the main face or screen you see. We are recording this webinar and plan to post the video online soon for folks who were unable to make it with us tonight. All right. So,
hey, Natasha.
Yep.
I think Francisco is trying to get you to update them as a panelist.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, let me do that real quick. Thank you. And throughout this webinar, we will also have a someone who is providing live captions. So the entire webinar is going to have captions. One second here. Perfect. And then to see those captions, you guys will see a CC icon at the bottom of your computer screen. If you'd like captions, you can just click that CC icon and the caption should come right up.
Hi, Natasha. Sorry, this is Francisco. I don't see the CC access yet.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you. That's it. Yep.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So let's get started. Thank you for joining us today again for the second webinar of the Gorgeous Wildlife series. My name is Natasha Stone and I'm your host. I am the Community Engagement Specialist at Friends of the Columbia Gorge. As Friends' Community Engagement Specialist, I manage our outdoor youth education efforts and work to build a diverse and inclusive network of our community partners to protect, preserve, and steward the Columbia Gorge. With me is our two featured speakers today, Francis Fischer and Joe Engler. Francis Fischer is the Land Trust Associate for Friends of the Columbia Gorge and also the organizer for the Gorge chapter of the Oregon Bee Atlas. Fischer holds a Bachelor of Science in Conservation Biology and Ecology with a minor in entomology from Montana State University, where she worked in several ecology labs studying native bees and climate change. Joe Engler is a native bee expert and instructor for the Portland, Gorge, and Central Oregon areas for the Oregon Bee Atlas. Before retiring, he was the regional wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Wildlife Refuge Program covering the Pacific Northwest and Hawaiian Islands. Before I hand it off to Francis and Joe, I wanted to talk a little bit about Friends and how we're all here right now. For anyone who may have been invited to this webinar by a friend and are still getting to know who we are. So we'll jump right into it here. Friends of the Columbia Gorge is the only conservation group entirely dedicated to protecting, preserving, and stewarding the Columbia Gorge. Friends led the fight to protect the gorge by helping create the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area over 40 years ago, and it's been working ever since to safeguard the gorge and make sure the natural wonders found today are preserved for generations to come. Friends is entirely dedicated to protecting and enhancing the scenic, natural, cultural, and recreational resources in the gorge. In celebration of International Biodiversity Day and Friends' 40th year anniversary, ensuring the gorge remains a vibrant, living place for both people and species such as bees, we produce gorgeous wildlife. Because many of us can't access the outdoors as easily right now, we wanted to bring the outdoors to you with some amazing wildlife that lives right here in the gorge. Join us for the last webinar of Gorgeous Wildlife on May 28th. We'll talk about the West Coast's only native freshwater turtle, the Western Pond, and how several state agencies and organizations are collaborating together with Friends to restore the population in the gorge. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Francis and stop sharing my screen so Francis can share hers. Perfect. And Francis can start us off by talking about bees in the gorge.
Sorry, I was muted still.
Okay.
Can everyone see my screen? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, making sure.
Great.
So yeah, I just wanted to start off with, I'm Francis. I just wanted to start off giving you guys a quick introduction into bees of the gorge and the Oregon Bee Atlas before Joe gets into some specifics about some bees that you could see in your backyard or definitely in the gorge. So let's get to it. I wanted to start by talking about what a bee is. I know a lot of you guys know what it is, but I thought I'd give a quick overview because it's confusing sometimes if you don't know insects really well. So bee is a flying insect closely related to ants and wasps. Bees actually evolved from wasps about 130 million years ago, around the time that flowers started to show up as well, evolutionarily at least. Flowers and bees co-evolved into a mutually beneficial relationship where the bee gets food from the flower and the flower gets pollinated when the bee moves its pollen to another flower of the same species. Bees differ from wasps in many ways, but the most important is that bees eat pollen and nectar. They rely solely on flowers for their food source, including in the larval stage. So a wasp will kill prey and bring the dead prey back to its nest to feed, but a bee, it takes nectar and it takes pollen back to its young to feed their young, or in the form of carrying pollen back and putting it in a nest where they lay their eggs on a pollen source. So they're covered in hair to collect pollen, and they have these hair-like structure called scopa to carry the pollen, like on the pollen baskets here on the bumblebee, or the underside of the abdomen on this megachilid bee. So that's what makes them different and a lot cuter in my opinion. So like I said, they're related to ants and wasps in the order Hymenoptera. They're worldwide, there's about 20,000 or more species of bees. In Oregon, we think there's about 500, but we don't have a complete source on that to understand that yet, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. This is a little taster into how cool and diverse our bees are in Oregon. This is a poster from the Oregon Bee Atlas, so you'll get to see more of them. So why bees are important to the gorge? Of course, bees pollinate the vast majority of the crops in the gorge. That means all of our orchard fruit, as well as strawberries, blueberries, squash, and anything that you're going to find at a farmer's market, most things at least, that you find at a farmer's market in the gorge, it's going to be pollinated by bees. We call bees and other pollinators keystone species because they're vital to maintaining healthy ecosystems. They are essential for plant reproduction, produce and produce genetic diversity in plants as they pollinate them. The more diverse plants are, the better they can weather changes in their environment, such as climate change. And this comes into why bees help contribute to the recreation economy of the gorge, because people come from all over the world to see our forests and our beautiful wildflowers, and of course they would, and of course eat our food, and they wouldn't be able to do any of that if we didn't have bees. And ultimately, with protecting our forests and our ecosystems, they're protecting our natural resources, keeping our soils rich and our air and water clean. So when I talk about bees, a lot of people think I'm talking about honeybees, and yes, honeybees are of course important to agriculture, but honeybees only supplement the work of native pollinators. In a lot of crops, specialist pollinators do a better job than generalist honeybees. And when I say generalist, I mean that a honeybee is bred to attempt to pollinate any kind of flower that it comes in contact with, but it doesn't mean that it will do the job very well. Native bees, some native bees are specialists of plants and have co-evolved with the plant to perfectly pollinate it. For examples, blueberries, this is blueberry flower. Blueberries are native to the Pacific Northwest and have evolved with this cute little blueberry bee. I think this one's probably one of the cutest. They have evolved together for millions of years, and this blueberry bee is specially designed to perfectly pollinate this flower. It's kind of a weird flower. A lot of bees can't pollinate it, but this one does perfectly. When a honeybee tries to pollinate it, a lot of the time it will give up and do this thing called nectar robbing. So it'll chew at the base of this flower and suck out the nectar without pollinating the part of the plant that needs pollination to produce the fruit. So it ends up that this bee and native bees pollinate this plant like 200 times better. They create twice as much fruit as when a honeybee pollinates a blueberry. Same kind of thing with this squash bee. Squash bees are native to Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. They've been found on the coast, and they are perfectly designed to pollinate this kind of crazy flower, the squash flower, which a honeybee definitely can't do. Also, there's different kinds of pollination, including buzz pollination, that a lot of flowers, including tomatoes and other crops and native plants like the prairie star needs to have them be pollinated, and bumblebees do this perfectly, whereas honeybees can't do it. And I want to show you guys what buzz pollination looks like. So let's see how this works. Am I sharing it yet? Okay. So I'm sharing this video screen, I think. Okay. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yes, looks great.
It wasn't showing on mine. Okay, so this is a bumblebee buzz pollinating this flower, and what it's doing is it's shaking its flying muscles and buzzing them so that the pollen shoots out of these anthers right here and cover the bee in that pollen so that it can take the pollen back to its nest, but also take that pollen to the next flower. It's so cool to see this up close, I think, in slow motion. They're so beautiful, and when you see it, it's like they're just buzzing around, but it's like really spectacular to see it so slow like this. So back to the PowerPoint. Lastly, before I get into the atlas, I just wanted to explain how bees are being affected by climate change. And so we know that bees are being negatively affected by humans because of habitat loss, exposure to some pesticides, and climate change. A lot of people, I know that most people know the mechanics by which that bees are losing habitat and being exposed to pesticides, but climate change, becomes a little bit more complicated, and it's because of this issue that's kind of the foundation of the reason bees are being affected by climate change, and that's phenological mismatch. Now, bees are super diverse. Some are generalists and can feed off and pollinate any plant, a lot of different flowers, and they also may live a little bit longer, so they're going to need a food source the food source that's existent all through their lifespan, so they can feed their young. And other bees are specialists, so they can only feed off specific kinds of flowers, and those kind of bees a lot of the time are only around for a short period of time, and a lot of flowers can only be pollinated by specific kinds of bees. So just flowers and bees, they emerge at different times throughout the year based on a lot of different factors, including rising temperatures, snow melt, and daylight hours. So for example, say this flower, this is a glacier lily on the left. It's a beautiful yellow flower that we see in the early spring in the gorge. It's like the first flower to bloom in the spring after the snow melts. And it is pollinated by bumblebees. And it's not pollinated really well by any other plant or any other bee. And so this flower, it blooms based on the warmer days and the snow melt. But the bumblebees that pollinate it are coming up based on, or emerging from their nests based on daylight hours, which that doesn't change. That's consistent every year, no matter climate. So normally when they are blooming and emerging at the same time, but with climate change, this flower is blooming earlier and it blooms without the bumblebee there. So it blooms and dies with less reproductive success because there's no bumblebees to pollinate it. And then when the bumblebee finally emerges, its flower that normally has as a food source in the early spring isn't around, it may be reproductively less successful, or it even could starve to death. So this is just a specific example from thousands of possible mismatches between pollinators and plants caused by climate change. Okay, so the Oregon Bee Atlas. This is a really fun project. The Oregon Bee Atlas is a project started in 2018 under the leadership of Anthony Melithopoulos, in congruence with the statewide pollinator protection plan called the Oregon Bee Project. It's through Oregon State University and the Oregon State University Extension Service, and it also is in congruence with a lot of other groups as well. So one of the goals of the Atlas is to train volunteer citizen scientists to help create an inventory of the state's native bees and what flowers they prefer. And they're attempting to create this inventory because although we estimate there are about 500 species of bees in Oregon, there's never been a concerted survey on the state's bees. Without even a checklist of species, it's really difficult to know whether the health of Oregon bees is improving or declining. And it's just foundational for research on bees and pollinator interactions and many ecological research studies that we could be having if we had this basic research done. So it's just super vital to have. In practice, what this project is, it means that the Atlas trains volunteers to go out and collect bees on natural landscapes and record data, including what plants the bees are interacting with. We then, as volunteers, attempt to identify the bees to the best of our abilities with the help of instructors like Joe, and send the bees and the data to Corvallis to be properly identified by taxonomists like Lincoln Best. Here's just like an example of a bee box. And there's so many people that do this project, and I can't name them all, but they're amazing and super great to work with. Out of Corvallis. There are around 200 volunteers statewide collecting in areas all across Oregon. There are workshops, online trainings, even a yearly conference for Atlas members in Corvallis. The new online training is super awesome. I'm really excited to use it, and you guys are going to get a little taste of it because some of our later videos in the lecture are from online modules, so you'll get to see that. So this is how Friends is involved with the Oregon Bee Atlas. So this is a picture from an Oregon Bee Atlas collection day at MOSIER Plateau last year. MOSIER Plateau is a Friends of the Columbia Gorge land trust property that's famous for its spectacular and biodiverse wildflower communities. It is so awesome. It's the perfect place for a collection site. In the spring, it's like a bee city. It's like they're just zooming around and like interacting with each other. It's kind of crazy to see. It's awesome. So in 2019, the Oregon Bee Atlas needed a new organizer for the Gorge chapter, and I had just started working for Friends. I was looking for a way to work with bees again, so it was perfect. It was so fun. Joe came out and trained me and some volunteers to help create this inventory of bees that's super vital for research in the future. So we go to MOSIER and other natural sites about once a month or twice a month to collect bees in nets so that we can send the specimens to Oregon State University for their collections and research. You can see Joe here with one of our volunteers, CJ, with their nets. We're the main collectors for the Oregon Bee Atlas in the Gorge. I know that there's a Portland group through Elaine Rybeck that also does some collecting sporadically on a site in the Columbia Land Trust property, on Columbia Land Trust property in the Dalles, but we're the main collectors and we're the most consistent collectors for the Gorge, which is super important because the Gorge is so geologically unique and has such unique ecosystems. And the Mosher Plateau is so special because it's right in between that dry eastern gorge and that wet western gorge. It's like the perfect spot. It's like the perfect bee spot. I also just wanted to say this is just such a fun activity, and I feel so lucky to be able to do it with friends and with Oregon Bee Atlas, because you know, I personally, I love bees forever. I'm a huge bee nerd, but I feel like a lot of people don't take the time to look at the insect world and enjoy it. I think that I'd love to, if you take anything from this talk, I hope that some of you guys just sit down in your yards or in a park or in a natural space, buy a plant, buy a flower, and just watch the insect world around you for 10 minutes. And you'll just be amazed, because just watching, like looking up close to the insect world as large mammals, we don't always see how amazing these creatures are that are just like holding together the natural landscapes around us. So just look at how tiny and cute and how big they can be and how they interact with each other, and they fight. Sometimes they'll like fight over a flower, or they're just beautiful, amazing creatures. And I hope that you guys take the time to look at them, because I love doing it with Oregon Bee Atlas. So here is a picture from one of our pinning parties at one of our volunteer Myrna's house. So yeah, we do have to kill the bees because you can't look at them and identify them very well unless you have the specimen, but I promise we are not killing all the bees in Mosher. We're just getting a tiny sample from a tiny amount of time. We're just getting a little tiny sliver so we can see what species we have. So yeah, it's just such a fun project. It's a great cause. It's really important to have this kind of inventory for research. And I just want to thank Anthony and all the group at Corvallis that is helping us do this great project, and Friends, of course, for hosting us on the Land Trust. So if you want to get involved with the Oregon Bee Atlas and become a master melittologist, is what we're calling it now, go to the website and add your name to the waiting list so that you can join up and start learning more than you're going to learn in this presentation. You can learn so much about bees. It's endless possibilities of bee knowledge. And if you live in the Gorge and want to join the Oregon or the Gorge chapter, or you live a little bit farther out but you can drive out here pretty often, please email me and I'll put you on our email list. And with that, I will pass the lecture off to Joe.
Okay, all right, thanks, Francis. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to give you an introduction to the bees of the Pacific Northwest, and which also includes the Gorge, obviously. I'm going to talk pretty much at a general level. That's the bee families, and on the taxonomic chart to the right, you can see where the family falls down, third from the bottom. To me, from the family on down through the genus and species, these are really the functional groups for bees. When you start to learn them at this level, you start to learn the different characteristics, the nesting sites that they need, as well as some of their food that they use, the different plants they forage on. And this is really important from a management and conservation standpoint to understand which of these groups of bees that you have out there, because bees are not continuous over the landscape. They vary locally in a lot of cases. Even from half a mile away, you can get a very different type of bee out there. So it's important to really know what's on your site to do proper management and conservation. So I am going to primarily discuss things at a family level. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see we have 6 families of bees in the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to talk about 5 of those. The middle group there, the Mellididae, I'm not going to discuss. There's only 2 species known from the Pacific Northwest. Only one of them has been found in Oregon, and that one hasn't been seen in quite a few years. But it is a specialist on sunflowers. And hopefully, hopefully through the Oregon Bee Atlas, we may actually find that bee once again. Right. Next. All right, Francis mentioned that bees can be generalists or specialists. So I just want to reiterate the point that when we generally hear these terms, we are talking about the bee's ability to collect pollen. So again, a generalist can collect pollen from a wide variety of plants. That gives it a lot of different advantages in the environment in terms of how it can, areas that it can occupy, as also as in terms of its lifespan for a particular adult. A specialist bee, on the other hand, can have a very limited diet. In some cases, some of these bees only can forage or collect pollen from one specific plant species. Generally, it may be a genus of species and sometimes a family. But again, some of these are incredibly specialized, so have a very limited range within our environment. And as you would expect, there's a lot of variation or gradation between the generalist and the specialist. Okay. All right, a little bit about the social systems. So bees have a number of social systems. The first one is basically social or eusocial, and you see that life cycle on the left-hand side of the screen. And these are our bumblebees. In the case of the bumblebees, they have a queen who lays the eggs, and a worker caste that takes care of the nest and does the foraging. On the other hand, or the other extreme, we have solitary bees. In this case, it's the female solitary bee that does all the work. She does all of her own foraging. She brings all the pollen back. She builds the nest. She builds the nest chambers, and she lays the eggs. But once she's gone, she's gone for good. She does not take care of the young in any way, shape, or form. So those are the two extremes in terms of the social systems. But in between, we had a couple other options. And again, we're going to see, you would see a gradation of this in reality. So we have aggregations of bees, and these are generally solitary bees, but they may nest very close together, in some cases an inch apart on the ground, but they maintain their own nest sites. Other bees are considered communal. In this case, several females may use the same nest entrance, but once they're into the nest itself or under the ground, then they will build their own tunnels and own nest chambers. And the other group in between are called semi-social. These bees approach the issue or approach the same situation as bumblebees will. They may have several queens laying eggs, but other females who don't lay eggs will tend the nest, build the nest chambers, etc. And one of those differences between them and the social bumblebees is once the nest is finished, they will leave. There is no care for the young, and there's no returning to that nest at all. Okay. All right, a little bit on nesting strategies or nest types. In the middle and on the top, you see the bumblebee nest. We've seen that in this photo already. You can see all those workers in there. Again, that's unique pretty much to only the bumblebees. We don't really see that in any of our other native bees. On the left-hand side, on the top, we have solitary bees in a nest block. Each of these, most of our bees from this who use wood will use preformed holes made by other insects, any of the wood boring beetles and some of those. And in this case, they're using an artificial nest, obviously, but these would technically be a solitary bee and this one female using each of these sites. On the lower left, you see kind of a unique situation where a female laid her egg inside of an old snail shell. This is kind of an extreme case in terms of a solitary bee. And then on the next block in the middle, on the bottom, we have a large carpenter bee. So that next group of bees that don't use preformed holes actually will excavate their own holes either into dense wood, like this large carpenter bee, or they will burrow into dead stems, such as blackberry canes, and use the inside of the pithy area in order to make their nest. Now on the right side, we see a lot of this diagram here shows a lot of underground nests. Approximately 70% of all bees are ground nesters. So that's a really important thing to take into consideration from a management and conservation standpoint, particularly if you're in an area where you're doing any sort of ground disturbance, and even in some cases, mowing your lawns. And so many of these nests, maybe like the top one, number A, that may only be 5 inches under the ground, if that. In other cases, such maybe as in B, these nests may go many feet under the ground. So there's probably as many configurations for these underground nests as there are bee species, most likely. So on the very bottom, about like in G, that may be a nest that's more typical of a communal nesting bee, where several females may use that entrance off to the right, but once they're under the ground, they may build their own tunnels and their own nest chambers, but they don't do any cooperative nesting per se. Okay, next. All right, going into the families themselves that we have. The ANDRENIDAE, this is our first big family. This is the largest family of bees worldwide. And in the Pacific Northwest, there's over 200 species that we know about. And these are called the mining bees. And if you look at the little picture there on the right-hand side, you can see they can build fairly elaborate nests under the ground. And these are bees that you can also actually find in your yard. If you have a yard that's not super dense in terms of its lawn or turf, you can certainly find some of these species nesting even in lawn situations. So there are only 4 genera in this family. I'm just going to talk about the first one, the genus ANDRENIDAE. The other 3 are small, hard to find, and relatively uncommon. ANDRENIDAE tends to be common. So one of the things about ANDRENIDAE in particular is an early emerger. Usually our bumblebees are the first bees to emerge in the late winter and spring. The next bee that we generally see in the Northwest are the ANDRENIDAE. So early emergence puts a few different twists to the way they operate because there's far fewer flowers out on the landscape at that time. So we do tend to see more specialists in this particular group. In the Pacific Northwest, in particular, a lot of these ANDRENIDAE are specialists on willows, the early blooming willows. But you do get again, the whole range of generalists to specialists in terms of what they may or the type of life strategy they have. Okay, next. Our next family is the MEGACHILIDAE. You're probably familiar with this family, other than you may know it by other names, such as the leafcutter bee, mason bee. So this is another very large family, a lot of genera, as you can see up there at top, and a lot of species in the Pacific Northwest. So when you have a very diverse and very abundant or speciose group of bees, you can expect there's going to be a lot of pollen specialists in particular. And most of these bees nest in wood. Now, some of the things that make the MEGACHILIDE unique is the fact that some of them are very important for agricultural pollination, particularly the MEGACHILIDE, as that bee is up in the upper right-hand corner, and then the darker bluish bees down in the lower corners, which are osmia right there. So again, very important, and they are basically raised specifically for pollinating agricultural crops. So again, the MEGACHILIDAE, and Francis mentioned this, there's a few unique things about MEGACHILIDAE. One of those, if you look at that bee in the top right, you can see that the scopa, or the pollen carrying hairs, are underneath the abdomen. Now, this is the only family of bees that have that characteristic. All of our other bees put the pollen somewhere else on their body, usually the hind legs, either the tibia, the femur, or both, and in some cases other places as well. The other thing about the MEGACHILIDAE, the word MEGACHILID basically means large teeth. And if you look at that one in the middle, you see those gigantic mandibles. They use those for cutting leaves to put into their nest. And there in the middle, you can see a nest tunnel, which has been created out of the rolled up pieces of leaves that they cut out of those particular plants. So again, unique characteristics for this particular family. The large mandibles, again, and the scopal abdomen with the scopa are very unique just to this particular family. Okay, next. Okay, our next family is the plasterer bees, or also called the cellophane bees. We only have 2 genera in the Pacific Northwest, that is Colletes and Hylaeus. The photos that you see are of the genus Colletes, and these are ground nesters. So the unique thing about Colletes is that the female secretes a substance out of her Duffer's glands as well as saliva, and she lines the inside of her nest chamber with it, which makes it totally waterproof. In some cases, these bees their nest sites are known to go underwater for a length of time. And I've seen some of these nests along some of our major rivers that probably go underwater for months, several months. So these things are very waterproof, and helps them to survive in places where other bees cannot. And now a lot of bees can waterproof, or at least make their nest water resistant, but Colletes it to the extreme in terms of how they cellophane off their nest. The other genus here in this family is the Hylaeus. These are small, shiny black bees, pretty much completely hairless. They use preformed holes, usually in wood, but also in other situations, such as maybe rocks and crevices. The unique thing about Hylaeus is the fact that the females do not have scopa. They do not place pollen on their legs or on other parts of their body because they're basically hairless. And she eats the pollen and then takes it back to the nest to regurgitate it. And here we will look at a quick video of one of these eating the pollen. So she'll eat that, fill herself up, go back, regurgitate it in her nest, and make her pollen ball out of that. And then that's what the larvae will feed off of. Again, Hylaeus is the only genus that we know of that actually does this particular strategy in terms of its pollen collection. Okay, next. All right, our next group, or next family of bees is the HALICTIDAE. You probably have heard of these. These are the sweat bees. This is a very diverse and widespread group. It's also extremely abundant in many cases. In situations where we are trapping bees, these are by far the most common thing we will catch. They will often just fill up our traps in some cases. The bees, what we primarily think of as sweat bees, are those first three genera up there, the agapostemins, which are the metallic green sweat bees, and you can see one in the lower right-hand corner. Halictus, which is the bee in the upper right-hand corner, basically the same version, but not very showy in terms of colors, more muted colors, browns and blacks and light-colored hairs. And Lasioglossum look pretty much exactly like the Halictus as well. The other three genera I won't discuss, but Duphoria is probably one of the only specialists in the group. Everybody else is primarily a generalist in terms of their pollen collection. And Sphecodes, which is the last one there, is actually a kleptoparasite, which I will talk about here at the end near the end of the presentation. So again, these are very diverse and widespread group. They're mostly all ground nesters, and they also have a range of social systems. And so one of the things you'll see on this one, with this video, is they also, this is just a bee packing pollen onto her legs and other parts of her body. So again, this is what most of our bees do in terms of a pollen collecting strategy. And once she gets these all packed in, she will then go back, clean herself off in the nest, pack all this into a pollen ball, and then just lay her egg as well into the nest chamber. A lot of times you can see these, in certain flowers, you can see these bees rolling around in the flowers, even versus using their legs. They'll just roll around in the flower, just getting pollen all over them. So the last thing in here I just want to mention, so that third genus up there, Lasioglossum, is one of our common genera, but we also know very little about it. In the West, there's virtually no taxonomic keys for these. We probably have a fair number of undescribed species as well. And again, this is the one that can be extremely abundant in a lot of cases. And so it's kind of interesting that we know so little about it for the most part in the Western United States. Okay, next. Okay. All right, our last family we're going to discuss is the Apidae. Again, you can see there's quite a few genera. This has a lot of, maybe some of the ones you're familiar with. We'll talk about a few of those. So there's about 220 species in the Pacific Northwest. We'll find out how many are in Oregon, hopefully through the Bee Atlas as well. But we have, again, when you have a group this size with a lot of species and a lot of genera, you can expect that they're going to be present most of the season. So emergence is variable, but the bombus, which are our bumblebees, they are the first to emerge in late February and March, at least in this part of the world. And then some of the latest emergers may be Melisodes, and they may be persisting all the way into September and October. So, and those are all some of our common genera. So again, you would have generalists and specialists in this group, but almost all of them are ground nesters, except for the carpenter bees. We discussed the large carpenter bee in the previous slide. There's also a large carpenter bee nest on the lower bottom, which is in a yucca stem. This is from Arizona. And then the bee on the top, that bright, shiny bee on the top, is a small carpenter bee, and she will make her nest into something like a blackberry cane or something that has a nice, soft, pithy stem. But the rest of them are primarily solitary ground nesters. We're just going to go around the clock here in terms of looking at some of these photos. So in the lower left-hand corner, this is Pepinapis. This is the squash bee that Francis mentioned earlier. Again, it's a specialist on wild and cultivated squashes. The next photo to the two photos to the right are Havropoda miserabilis. And this particular bee is unique from the standpoint that you can see that it is a sand dune specialist, and this is one that is found from California up through Oregon and into the Long Beach Peninsula of Washington. So it's really a West Coast species for the most part. So very unique in terms of the fact that it's a sand dune specialist. There are a few others that are sand dune specialists as well, but this is one that's easily seen if you're in the right spots out on the beach. The middle picture up there, Bombus van Dijkii. This is one that was collected at MOSIER last year. Bombus van Dijkii is kind of one of my favorite bumblebees. It tends to be it's a cascade type of a bee. It's found only in the Cascades and then west to the coast from Washington down through California, and of course in the Sierras, but otherwise it's got somewhat of a limited range compared to most other bumblebees. In our top right corner, we have Eucera edwardsi. This is called the spring flying longhorn bee. And they are called longhorn bees obviously by these long antennae on the males. Now, Eucera is a spring flyer. It's out early in the year. Generally, it's emerging in April. And then it flies and is till about the end of June at the most, at which point all the adult cohorts will die off. It is then replaced by the Melisodes, which is the fall flying longhorn bees, also called sunflower bees because many of them specialize on sunflowers. So within that group of those genera, we have a few other things in there. Those last four, Nomada, Epiolus, Triepiolus, and Melector, are all cuckoo bees, which we'll talk about here in a couple more slides. Okay, next. Okay, for the bumblebees, we'll just talk a little bit more. You've already seen some photos of the nest sites, and those nest colonies can approach 400 individuals or more in some cases. So again, that is our social bee and kind of the exception to the rule. Bumblebees tend to be an exception for a lot of things compared to a lot of our other bees. One of the unique things about bumblebees is they can also raise their body temperature. So early in the morning, they can start vibrating their muscles. That gets their body temperature up. They can get out and start foraging quite early, usually before the crack of dawn. Usually I get up 6:30 to let my chickens out, and the bumblebees are already just swarming around my rhododendrons and some of the other plants that are in bloom. But this ability to control their body temperature also allows them to forage later into the afternoon and early evenings. They can forage on rainy days as well as cloudy days. And this is a huge advantage over all the other bees for the most part, which have to really rely on the sun to get them warm and allow them to be able to forage. Now, as far as we know, I think bumblebees are the only ones that can purposely raise their body temperature. There are other bees that actually are nocturnal. These are primarily in the Southwest deserts. But even in Oregon, we do have some bees that are crepuscular that forage only at the early morning hours and in the dark, and then late in the afternoon for a few hours. And it's not known exactly how they are able to do that even in those cold temperatures. So someday somebody will figure that out, but they don't think it's the same mechanism that bumblebees raise their temperature up. And again, the other unique thing about bumblebees is buzz pollination, which we saw a little bit earlier from Francis, her video. So we're going around the photos here. Bombus vagans was caught up at Mosier Plateau last year. Up till that point, Bombus vagans was only known in Oregon from the far eastern edge of the state along the Idaho border. So we have a pretty good range extension for this particular species, which is kind of exciting. Then the middle photo on the bottom is Bombus morrisonii. This is a fairly large, bright yellow bee. This is a bee that the IUCN considers to be vulnerable. Now, there are a number of rare bumblebees that we have in the state, and it's always good to document them. The Bumblebee Atlas, or the Bee Atlas and the Bumblebee Atlas, the Xerces Bumblebee Atlas, has documented these at a lot of new sites that we hadn't known about before, or has found them again at sites where they hadn't been seen for quite a while. So finding this in the gorge was particularly exciting. On the upper right is Bombus vosnesensky. If any of you have seen any bumblebees in your yard, the chances are it was this one. This is the yellow-faced bumblebee. It's by far our most common bumblebee in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a quick photo there on the bottom of the buzz pollination, as you saw the earlier video of. Okay, next. All right, my last slide is going to be here on the cuckoo bees. Cuckoo bees are not a family of bees. They are just a different life strategy. And there are cuckoo bees found in 3 of the families in the Pacific Northwest and in at least 10 genera as well. So the basic life cycle of a cuckoo bee, as you might guess if you heard anything about cuckoo birds, these are pretty much the same. These are kleptoparasites, or basically parasitic bees. And so these bees do not collect their own pollen. They do not collect, or they do not make their own nest at all. They parasitize the nests of other bees. So in the case of this particular bee, she will search around low on the ground looking for an open hole of some sort and check it out to see if it's a bee of the host species. And also in some cases, you may see these bees actually following other bees around, waiting for them to start digging a nest or going to the nest that they have. So once the host bee leaves her nest, these bees will sneak in, insert an egg into one of the nesting chambers, and then leave. So then what happens is the parasitic egg will hatch, usually before the host egg will, and that parasitic larvae will then either eat the egg or eat the larvae that is available. So this is fairly common in our bee groups to have a lot of these cuckoo bees, and we also have a lot of other parasitic or cuckoo type wasps as well as flies. So, and some of these are quite easy to recognize. They also look a lot like wasps, as you may have figured out by now. They don't have a lot of hair for the most part. They're often heavily armored. And they have a lot of different spines and other things on their bodies sometimes, much like wasps do. So in particular, if you get out right now, you still have a good chance of seeing this one on the lower right corner. This is the genus Nomata. These are almost all orange, red with black. Yellow, very, very diverse group. This is one we have really no good idea how many species we have. There are no taxonomy keys for it. We just know there are a lot of different species out there at this point. But this is one that's primarily, its host species are Andrena. So right now, while there are still Andrena out and about, you can see these things cruising around low to the ground, often in your yard, in your flower gardens, looking for open holes. So it's a one, like Francis mentioned, go out and just sit in your yard for a while and start looking. And if you see an orangish or reddish type bee that looks kind of like a wasp just zooming along the ground, looking around, it's most likely the Nomata. And then on the upper one is Sphecodes. This is another one that's somewhat easily recognized because of that bright red abdomen. Almost all of the Sphecodes have this bright red abdomen and black body. They tend to be more heavily armored. You can't see that as well without being under a microscope. But again, if you saw one outside, you would probably have a pretty good guess that it's a Sphecodes. There are a few other bees that show this color pattern, but Sphecodes by far does that the most. And Sphecodes is another one that we don't have really any good taxonomic keys for the West. Again, we don't have a good idea at this point how many species we have. So we're going to end here on another video, I believe, that has shows you a cuckoo bee basically checking out a host nest. This is the cuckoo bee here. That was the host bee that went into the nest. So the cuckoo bee is now waiting. The Coleoxys is waiting for that female to leave the nest. There it is, right under the nesting hole. And there is entering, getting ready to enter. The host is left, so she's now going in. She's going to go ahead and lay her egg, and then she's going to get back out of there as quick as possible. So in case the host female comes back, because they can end up getting into fights, and that's part of the reason that most cuckoo bees have some sort of heavy armoring or more rugose or armor type of a body, because of the fact that they do get into fights with host bees that come back. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Francis.
Okay, so last thing is what you can do in your house or just in general to help the bees. If you have a garden, number one thing is don't be afraid to keep it messy. So that means, well, first of all, try to have something that's blooming all year, because bees are, of course, emerging at different times. Some bees, they just need a food source basically at all times. So try to have something blooming all year, and try to plant native plants if you can. I even have created this list of plant species that are both native, mostly native and non-native, that are specific to the gorge, so that you can have something blooming in your garden all year. And we'll try to figure out a way to send that to people if they're interested. But so yes, of course, planting native plants. And number two, try to have have a bunch of different kinds of flowers for different kinds of pollinators. Some, of course, specialize, and they only have a specific kind of plant that they specialize on. So try to have a diverse amount of flowers. And this also means to try to stay away from like ornamental flowers that don't have a good nectar source. So like tulips and irises, I love them. They're not really good for bees. So I don't have just those. I have other plants in my garden that bees can feed off of. And then if you're going to try not to spray insecticides if you can, as much as possible. But if you have to spray insecticides, read the label. I am the wife of a farmer, and he gets really mad when people talk about insecticides, because they are super important a lot of times for farmers. But the problem is that everyday people have access to insecticides and pesticides that are really harmful to the environment, and they don't read the label. And the label on the back tells you when to spray it so that you're not going to harm pollinators. And a lot of people just don't listen to it and spray it anyway, and gives pesticides a bad rap in a lot of cases, and it's not good for the environment. And of course, keep your yard messy. Like I said earlier, leave bare ground for those ground nesting bees. Don't put weed cloth down or mulch if you can avoid it. Instead, maybe leave the leaves down. That's a good like mulch type thing that is also good for bees. And especially underneath plants, leave the leaves. If you're going to rake them in your yard, I understand that, but like underneath your rhododendrons, maybe leave the leaves. And then if you're going to cut, try not to cut the stems for those stem nesting bees in your plants. Instead, maybe cut them at 18 to 20 inches, or if you're going to cut them, put them in a pile out of the way so that they're not composted or burned, so that those bees can escape the next year when they emerge. Consider a bee lawn. I have one at my house that I'm planting with some yarrow, and I have a list of species you can plant. English daisy. I know people hate them, but dandelions are a great food source for bees. So just feel free to leave it messy. Let some of those little flowers and clover that smatter your lawn stay there. If you live in an apartment, don't have a yard, plant a native window box. How wonderful is that? It's a little island of food for your bees. Leaving a water source is great. Make sure to put marbles and rocks there so that the bees don't drown, but you're really thirsty in the hot times of the years. And lastly, of course, support your local conservation groups. The biggest thing for bees is climate change and habitat loss. And of course, conservation groups like Friends really help to fight against these things and help the bees. And if you want, I work in the stewardship department at Friends. Attend a stewardship work party. Come pull some invasive weeds that don't have floral sources for the bees and help us plant native plants that feed them. So with that, I think we are ready for questions.
Woo!
Here's our little bee butts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe and Francis. We're now going to go into Q&A. Please, again, all of your questions for Francis and Joe into the Q&A box below in the black toolbar at the bottom of your computer screen. If you're having trouble using the Q&A box, you can raise your hand It's a function that, again, is at the bottom of your computer screen. You just click that participants icon that has a few people in the picture on the icon. Click that, you can click raise your hand. This temporarily, I can unmute you and you can ask your question to Joe and Francis personally if you'd like. If you're unsure how your microphone is working, probably best to just type in your question to the Q&A box as well. And of course, we're just going to try to get through as many as we possibly can in the time that we have. So let's get going here. First question, of course, for Joe or Francis, whichever. This is from James. Are blueberry bees raised commercially?
I don't know the answer to that. Don't know, Joe?
I believe that, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the ones that is a commercial species. I'm not 100% sure, but.
Yeah, I know that bumblebees in general are raised commercially. I'll have to ask a blueberry farmer and get back to you.
No worries. All right, so then let's see. If I see a bee in my garden, is there a resource that I can use to easily identify it? Is there any type of, I don't know, maybe a book that folks can buy, or I know there's so many apps nowadays, but is there a resource that folks can kind of figure out how to identify bees?
It's never 100% that you can identify the bees in your yard. You have a good chance potentially of identifying some of your bumblebees, and there is a good book. It's the Bumblebees of North America, I believe, by Williams. That's probably the best resource for bumblebees because they do have color photos or pictures that basically would give you something like you see in this last slide here with the different hair patterns. Again, it's not 100%, but it will help you to recognize some of those bee species. And with the other ones, Francis showed you that thing from the Oregon Bee Atlas, that pamphlet. And there are some other books, but again, it's never going to be 100%. You may be able to get it to genus if you get if you get some experience, put it that way. But most bees have to be identified under a scope.
And one thing is, in Oregon Bee Atlas, we use iNaturalist. And again, like Joe says, it's pretty impossible to completely for sure identify a bee without putting it under a microscope and talking to a taxonomist. But a lot of insects I've identified them through the app iNaturalist. Like I saw a a tent caterpillar out the other day, and I was like, I'm not sure exactly what that is. And I took a picture of it, and iNaturalist identified it for me. It's a great app for wildflowers and insects in general. So it's a good place to start, and a lot of people will comment underneath and tell you if you can't find the answer to your question. But, you know, if you join the Oregon Bee Atlas, you learn a lot more about how to identify them.
Awesome, thank you guys. Next question by Linda. What bees pollinate some of the early Mosier flowers like balsam root, lupin, and sweet pea?
Certainly bumblebees to a certain extent, and probably some of the andrenids. Balsam root is actually, I think, tends to be pollinated by flies and some of the beetles, actually. There was I think Jim Kane out of Logan actually did a project in the Gorge area on balsam. He did it western wide, but we did collect bees from the Gorge as well on balsam root, as well as some of the other pollinators. So in terms of bees, it's probably primarily bumblebees and Andrena, because again, they are the earliest bees that are out there.
From my so I've been to Mosier collecting bees a little bit this year, just because I go there for stewardship work. And a lot of the ones I've noticed this year, and just especially with balsam root, because they're kind of sunflowery, longhorn bees love them. So those ones with the really long antenna that we saw a couple slides ago, here, nope.
Next slide back.
There we go. Oh, I messed it up. This one, the longhorn bees.
The next slide, that slide there. The upper right-hand corner is the longhorn bee that you would find on balsam root.
Yeah, and I found those on balsam root. And I've also found a lot of megachilids, so the ones with the big teeth, a lot of osmia. Well, this isn't, I haven't seen an orchard bee on there, but there's a big black osmia I see on them a lot of the time. Yeah, so definitely a lot of the big beefier bees like balsam root. Yeah.
Great. And then next question, I just want to remind folks, I see a lot of questions coming into the chat box. Please send your questions into the Q&A because that's where we're watching for them. I did see one from the chat box that I just want to mention real quick because I know a lot of folks may be asking, but if you see a swarm of bees alone, is it a good idea to try to contact someone or collect them? Is there a good organization to call locally, or what would you say, Joe and Francis?
Okay, so I used to keep bees in high school, and so I lived in Tennessee then, so I'm referring to when I was in Tennessee, but usually if you contact your extension service, they will get you in contact with a local apiary group. This is for honeybees, so no other bee really swarms besides honeybees. If you're a honeybee, if you keep bees and you have an empty hive ready for them, then and you know what you're doing, you can totally collect them and put them in a hive. But if you're worried about them and you want them out of your house for whatever reason or your yard, call your local even just call your local apiary. They might even just be like, oh, great, free swarm, and they'll come grab it for you. But I would suggest calling the extension service.
Great, thank you. Next question from Bert. How far do bees fly from their nests? Would they cross a body of water like the Columbia River?
It depends totally. Well, it depends on a couple of things. Certainly the size of the bee and also the food resources that are available. So will they fly across the Columbia? Yes, some of the bees will, particularly the bumblebees and some of the larger bees. They probably don't want to do that if they don't have to. They really from an energetic standpoint, they want to be foraging as close to the nest as possible. And so, but bumblebees in particular, and some of the large bees are known to fly upwards of 1 mile to 2 miles from their nest to collect pollen. In the case of some of the smallest bees, like the Dialictus, the small sweat bees, they may spend their entire life in a spot less as big as your front lawn, and that's it. So it really depends on the bee. And again, a part of it is certainly on how many of what the food resources are available. And certainly with habitat fragmentation and that, a lot of bees are probably energetically stressed because they are flying further and further away to find pollen and nectar. Mm-hmm. So there's no definitive answer. There's been quite a bit of work on that to some point, but again, you have a lot of bees out there, so it's kind of hard to make a good statement, I guess, in terms of how far they fly.
Thank you. From Linda, do all bees sting?
No. It's actually funny. One thing I was going to show that was from our module online is these bees right here, the alfalfa leafcutter bee. It's used for agriculture. Farmers, this is just an example, so a lot of bees don't sting, but farmers buy tubes of these, especially alfalfa farmers, and there's a video of them all emerging at once. And the guys, they're so cute. They're really tiny. I did research on them one summer, but you can just run your hand all over them. They don't sting at all. The stingers their stingers and bees are, they are specialized egg layer parts. So they, like for a bumblebee, they do sting. They actually don't hurt that bad. I'm allergic to honeybees, but I've gotten stung by bumblebees and all kinds of bees in my research before, and native bees don't tend to hurt as bad, I've noticed. There's a lot of bees that don't sting.
Right, and as just to chime in, I mean, because they are the stinger or the ovipositor is for egg laying, only females can sting if they sting at all. And again, it's primarily the bumblebees. Virtually none of your other native bees will sting you. I have been bitten by some before, but for the most part, they don't sting, other than bumblebees and honeybees.
Great, thank you guys. So a lot of questions about the murder hornet and the Asian giant hornet. Are they, just to try to cover a few top ones, are they a threat to bees in the gorge?
I don't know if you've looked into this a lot, Joe, but first of all, from what I know, they kind of specialize on attacking large nest of bees. So they will attack like a honeybee colony. And, but, you know, I'm not really sure if they're like a threat to like bumblebee colonies. I haven't really heard about that before. The research is just kind of coming out right now about that, but as a threat to any of these, and like these, like especially the solitary bees, I don't think they would have any interest in attacking them. There wouldn't even be enough food for them. I've heard they're like 2 inches long. So they're the most threat they would be is, if possible, to bumblebees, but I haven't seen any research suggesting that they're attacking bumblebee hives at all. So no, I don't think so. It's my guess.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it remains to be seen if they show up at all. So.
Mm-hmm.
From Cascade, we have how many bees typically live in a hive?
In a hive?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I mean, so that a honeybee hive, I mean, I'm not a honeybee person, but I believe you can have hundreds of thousands of bees in a honeybee hive. In terms of bumblebees, generally you would be less than 100, but some of them will have 400 or more. And of course, the difference being a bumblebee hive does not grow year after year. Those colonies die at the end of the year, unlike honeybees, which are continually producing more and more individuals over years, if not decades in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So in the terms of your other bees, it's most of your nest cells probably are dozens to less than 100 young through a female maybe. So I don't know if there's a lot of good information on that, but certainly not a lot, certainly not thousands of bees.
And then, Francis, if you don't mind typing your email into the chat box, I got a few folks asking about the native plants, the plant. If you don't mind sending, just typing your email into the chat box so folks can send.
Yes.
If they're looking for that list of native plants, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes.
And then, for Joe, how long do bees usually live? This is from Alex.
Okay, so for our native bees, basically they live about 1 year. There's exceptions to the case where a single bee may live a couple years. So really, a queen bumblebee, for the most part, lives the longest. So she would be basically born in the summer of year 1, and she will die at the fall of year 2. Again, there are a few exceptions, but in most cases, adult bees, the bees that you're seeing, the adult bees, generally only live a couple of weeks to a couple of months at the most. The longest life stage of a bee is the larval stage, which is underground for upwards of 10 months out of the year. But an individual really doesn't generally last more than a year.
All right.
With both life stages.
Because I have a lot of folks too asking about if bees return to their garden each season, sort of if the same bees return. So you would say most likely not.
Right, it wouldn't be the same bees, it would be the young of the bees that were there the year before.
They're babies.
Right.
All right, let's see here. Thanks everybody for sending in your questions. Of course, we've got a lot of them, so please be patient with me. From Cindy, where do mason bees fit in?
Here's a mace. Well, osmiads are mason bees, correct, Joe? Right here.
Yep. Yeah, basically osmia and some hoplites are considered to be the mason bees. The whole group of megachilids, most of them do mason type work in terms of just constructing their nests with mud, or in the case of the leafcutters, leaves. But yeah, I mean, typically we think of osmia as the mason bees.
And then, from Alex, how high up in tall apartment buildings will bees fly? I'm guessing if they wanted to plant their own bee garden, or windowsill or whatnot.
I don't know.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever seen any information on that. I would expect, if you just think of the natural situation in terms of forest, maybe some of the larger bees like bumblebees would go up and over a forest for foraging. So you may be 150, 200 feet in the air during a foraging run. The smaller bees generally are not going to be able to do that, which is one of the reasons the smaller bees tend to be more confined or have more problems in fragmented habitats because they simply can't forage that far. But in terms of altitude, I guess I don't really have any good answer, and I don't know if I've seen anything, but certainly maybe a dispersing bee can get, again, 200 feet up into the air if need be, but I don't know how common that is. I think a standard apartment around here wouldn't really be that much of an issue.
Yeah.
A few stories.
Great. Were gorge bee populations affected by the fire?
Well, I can try that. Yeah, I mean, certainly to a certain extent they will be. Given, the food resources disappeared, and most likely a lot of the places where the fires were really hot probably burned enough of the ground and heated the ground to kill a lot of the larvae or the eggs that were underground. Now, as that one picture showed, some of these can be burrowing feet into the ground. So in that case, they probably would not have been affected as much. But again, we also don't know what exactly bees are, we don't know the specifics for all the bee species in the gorge, number one, or particularly what maybe their nest strategy is or the depths of their nests are. But by and large, I would say for a short term, they have certainly were affected. Once things start coming back, they're going to benefit from the fires.
Yeah, exactly. They're definitely short term. Those generations are going to die off. But when I was in my undergraduate, I did a summer studying bee populations post-fire throughout the years. And one of the great things about fire is that they're disturbing, they're burning down that story where it's a lot of bushy stuff, and they're letting room for all these wildflowers. So if you've ever been hiking, like I'm thinking of a hike on Mount Hood, Elk Cove or Elk Pond or something, I can't remember. I've only been here for a year, so I think it's Elk Cove, but or Elk Meadow. Anyway, it just had a burn like 5 years ago, and it is chock full of wildflowers. And every year I come back, it's just like this swarm of bees because there's so much food for them. So I think in the long term, when you start going out there again, when it's opened up, you'll start seeing like the spectacular wildflowers that are triggered by fire and that are allowing these bees to have a crazy food source in that area.
Right. One of the things to remember on bees, I mean, Eagle Creek fire was primarily all timber and pretty contiguous timber in forest areas, and bees generally do not occur a lot in the forest. They like open landscapes where there's a lot of flowers, and you don't find that in mature forests like much of what burned at Eagle Creek. So during that fire, there probably weren't a lot of bees in there to begin with. Certainly nothing that you would find like you would find along the edges or in open meadows. So that'd be one thing to just keep into consideration. But like Francis just said, now that these are going to be opened up to a lot more wildflowers, bees will definitely benefit from the fire.
Thank you. From Molly, in the evening, we see bees that look like they've fallen asleep in our flowers. Why are they staying there overnight?
Exactly that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I had that same question in my early years of studying bees. I thought something was really wrong, but in most cases, those are most likely males. Males do not go back to the nest for any reason once they leave. So males will often congregate on flowers, sometimes in groups, or huddled together. There's certainly cases of that. So for the most part, it's probably going to be males, or in some situations, as we mentioned about some bees not being able to fly in bad weather. Sometimes they're out foraging, the weather goes bad, the sun goes in, it starts to rain, and sometimes they just have to hunker down any place that they can. So that would be my two explanations of it.
Probably also the cutest thing that you've ever seen.
And then, sorry guys, we're gonna have to wrap up here pretty quick, maybe just another 2 minutes. I'm so sorry we're not gonna be able to get to everybody's questions, but for the 142 of you that are still with us, thank you so much for staying in with us this long. And again, if you have any questions in particular that we didn't get to that you're really interested in getting answered, send Francis an email and we'll try to figure that out for you. Again, thanks for everyone that's still stayed with us and joined us here tonight. I'm going to take 2 more questions. Let's see here. For the, sorry, I'm looking through here. For folks looking to start their own, maybe become beekeepers themselves, what is I guess an important species they're asking in the state of Oregon that would be good for them to start with?
So beekeeping is mostly geared towards honeybees. You can keep some bees, but if I was you, I would recommend looking into bee hotels. So that's a way to give a lot of habitat for native bees in your yard. And I'm sure you've seen them before. They sell them everywhere now, but I would recommend making your own. And I also recommend following the directions on it, which a lot of the time means that you would need to clean them yearly, because some people will just get bee hotels and then they'll just be rampantly run into parasites and diseases that would be avoided if it was a natural situation. When you're making your own bee hotel, you need to make sure you're cleaning them so that they're not attracting parasites and diseases.
Great, thank you. And then let's do, real quick, what are some other pollinators? You guys mentioned that bees pollinate most crops or plants and flowers in the gorge. What are some other important pollinators?
Hummingbirds, moths, butterflies, beetles, ants, wasps even, flies for sure. In the Southwest, we have bats pollinating things. There's some marsupials in the tropics that are pollinating things. There's just all kinds of things pollinating all kinds of stuff. It's very interesting and very cool. I would totally look into it. We have a whole poster about it up here, but yeah, lots of things. Lots of insects, lots of animals. Hummingbirds for sure out here.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna wrap up there, you guys. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I wish I could get to everyone's. We could stay here all night, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Fran, for taking the time to do this with us for Gorgeous Wildlife.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Talk to you later.
Have a good night, everyone.